He thought he'd lost his twin daughters forever, believed they were gone, vanished into the past. But 3 years later, he found them singing on a bus, their voices carrying a secret that would shatter not just his heart, but his entire world before the story even began. Wherever you're watching this from, drop your city in the comments below. We'd love to see how far this story reaches. If you're moved by these stories, don't forget to subscribe and join our family. Now, lean in and let the story unfold. The sun hung low and heavy over the horizon, casting a cruel amber light across the dusty main street of Hollow Creek. The town had gathered in the square not for celebration, nor for justice but for something far uglier. On a makeshift platform built from old wagon boards and whiskey crates stood a woman barefoot, bruised and pregnant. Her long, once beautiful hair was matted and clung to her neck in the heat. Dirt painted her face in streaks, but it couldn't fully hide the tear tracks carved through them. Next to her, clutching the hem of her worn dress, was a boy no older than 5. His eyes, impossibly wide and far too knowing for his age, darted around the silent crowd. One of his knees was scraped raw, and his lips quivered without sound. No one looked him in the eye. The man behind them, tall, red-faced, and swaying with every breath, was their seller. "All right," he slurred, lifting a bottle and waving it like a preacher's hand. "One woman, good bones, knows how to cook, carrying a children mine, comes with a boy. Quiet one. Won't make trouble." Nobody spoke. The townsfolk shifted uncomfortably, some pretending not to watch, others pretending they didn't care. A few men chuckled, others just spit into the dirt and looked away. The woman didn't beg. She didn't cry. Whatever tears she'd had left had dried up weeks ago. She simply held her son close, her fingers trembling as they clutched his shoulder. If he noticed her fear, he didn't speak of it. He just leaned into her side like he was trying to disappear. "This ain't slavery," the drunk man continued. "Ain't nobody breaking the law. I'm just setting her free to whoever wants the responsibility. Cheap, too." Still, no one moved. Until he did. From the far end of the street, a lone rider came into view. His horse moved slow and steady, hooves kicking up small clouds of dust. The rider was wrapped in a faded duster coat, the wide brim of his hat hiding most of his face. He didn't speak. He didn't nod. He simply dismounted and walked, bootsteps heavy, toward the platform. The seller squinted at him. "You here to buy something, friend?" No answer. The man reached into his coat, pulled out a small pouch, and tossed it toward the seller. It hit the wooden planks with a metallic clink. Heavy, real. The crowd stirred. The drunk man bent down, opened the pouch, and his eyes lit up. "Well, I'll be. That'll do just fine." The woman looked up then for the first time. Her eyes searched the stranger's face, but it gave her nothing. No warmth, no cruelty. Just calm. Like a man who had already made peace with every demon in him. The boy moved behind his mother, clutching tighter. "Go on, then." The seller slurred. "She's yours now." The stranger stepped forward. No words, no reach. He simply extended his hand, not to grab, not to pull, but to offer. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the woman took it. Her grip was weak, uncertain, but she held on. She looked down to her son, nodded once, and together they stepped off the platform. The crowd watched in silence as the stranger led them away. Not toward the saloon, not toward the stables. Out of town, into the desert, into something unknown. The wind carried a bitter chill as they left Hollow Creek behind. The dust from the town's dry streets settled like a veil between them and the lives they once knew, lives filled with judgment, scorn, and the kind of silence that spoke louder than any shout. The stranger's horse trudged steadily along the rutted dirt road. His coat was a patchwork of years worn thin, but it shielded him from the rising chill of dusk. The woman, whose name she had long since forgotten, sat stiffly in the wagon. He'd brought a creaking wooden box on wheels, drawn by a mule as old as the hills. Her son nestled beside her, eyes wide and guarded. No one spoke. Words felt too heavy, like weights that might break the fragile quiet. The stranger's face was mostly hidden beneath the shadow of his hat, but when he glanced sideways, she caught the faintest flicker of something like sorrow, or maybe it was guilt. She wasn't sure which was worse. Her hands trembled as she reached for the water canteen he'd passed her earlier. She took a sip, then offered it back without a word. The boy watched her, silent and still, clutching a ragged doll with missing eyes. She had no name for him either. Hours passed under the slow crawl of a sun retreating behind distant mesas. The sky burned in shades of red and purple before surrendering to the deep blues of night. Stars pricked through the darkness like cold promises. The wagon's wheels rattled, the mule's steady clop punctuated only by the occasional creak of the harness. At some point, she realized the silence wasn't empty, it was waiting. Waiting for a crack, a break, a reason to fall apart. But she didn't have one. The stranger finally spoke when the moon had risen high enough to cast silver light on the dust swirling at their feet. "You ever been free?" His voice was rough, low, carrying the weight of too many years spent talking to no one. She didn't answer. How could she? Freedom was a word she barely remembered. To her, freedom was the absence of chains that weren't always physical. Her memories were a landscape littered with barbed wire and broken promises. The house she had once called home was a place where silence screamed and shadows hid the truth. Her mother's eyes, cold and unforgiving, had been the first prison. The hands that had sold her like a piece of cattle, the first betrayal. She'd learned long ago not to expect rescue, not to hope for mercy. So she said nothing. The boy, sensing tension, shifted closer to her. She reached down and brushed the tangled hair from his forehead. A small gesture she didn't know she still had left in her. The man's wagon creaked as it rolled over a hidden stone, jolting them all awake from the quiet. "I ain't gonna ask your name," he said after a long pause. "Names don't mean much out here. What matters is what you choose to do with the one you got." She stared out at the endless stretch of Landry, harsh, unforgiving, knowing he was right. A name was just a word, but survival was something you built every day, piece by piece. The boy finally spoke, voice barely more than a whisper. "Where are we going?" She looked down at him and saw the fear and hope tangled together in his small face. The kind of hope that only a child could carry when the world had already beaten them down. "We're going somewhere new," she said, though she didn't know if it was true. The man's hand rested briefly on the side of the wagon, steady and sure. "We don't follow roads out here. We make our own." That night, the strangers set up camp beside a small creek. The mule was unharnessed and fed while he tended to a fire with practiced hands. The woman and the boy stayed in the wagon, wrapped in thin blankets that smelled faintly of leather and smoke. She watched the flames dance and thought about the life she'd left behind, years of fear. The coldness of a mother who traded her for a few coins. The endless nights spent praying for a dawn that never came. She wasn't sure she knew how to live outside those shadows. But the man didn't ask for stories he didn't deserve. He simply sat nearby, the firelight casting deep shadows on his weathered face. In the silence, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sliver of safety. The next morning, the sun was pale and the air crisp as the man handed her a simple breakfast biscuits and thick coffee in a chipped tin cup. The boy ate eagerly, his small hands trembling less than the day before. She watched him and felt a strange swell in her chest, something like hope, or maybe the weight of responsibility. She was his mother, whether the world saw her as one or not. After breakfast, the man gestured toward a distant ridge. "We'll find shelter before night. This place." He nodded toward the horizon. "It's got hard bones, but it breathes." She wanted to ask what that meant, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she lifted the boy from the wagon and set him on his feet. "Come on, Git." He hesitated, then stepped down, clutching her hand. Together, they followed the man's slow, sure steps across the cracked earth. The land was wild here, scattered with scrub and thorny bushes. The sky stretched endlessly, sometimes cloudless, sometimes heavy with threats of rain. It was both beautiful and brutal. For the first time in years, she let herself breathe without bracing for pain. The man led them to a small, weather-worn cabin nestled between two gnarled oaks. Its walls sagged under the weight of time, and the windows were dirt-streaked, but it stood steady. "This'll be our home for now." She looked at him, searching for a catch, a snare, but found only quiet resolve. He unlocked the door and pushed it open, revealing a modest room lit by shafts of morning light. The air smelled of wood smoke and old earth. Inside, there was a table scarred by years of use, a small stove, and a single bed pushed against the wall. "This place," she said softly. "It's more than I deserve." He shrugged, but there was a gentleness in his eyes that stopped her from speaking further. Over the days that followed, she learned the rhythm of the place, the crackle of fire, the whisper of wind through the trees, the way the mule's hooves sounded on the porch boards. The boy explored cautiously, finding small treasures in the weeds and stones. His laughter, rare and hesitant, was a balm she hadn't realized she needed. The man was quiet but not cold. He fixed what was broken: boards, fences, a leaky roof, and made room for them without asking too much. They built a life from silence and sweat. She washed clothes in the creek and cooked simple meals. The boy helped gather firewood, and the man watched over them both with tired eyes that seemed to carry 1,000 unspoken stories. Each night, they sat by the fire, the flames their only witnesses. The past was never far, but here it lost some of its sharp edges. One evening, as a soft rain began to fall, she stood on the porch watching the world blur beneath the gray sky. The man approached quietly and draped a worn shawl across her shoulders. She didn't thank him. She didn't have to. For the first time in years, she felt a small thread of something fragile and new weaving through her, a promise that maybe, just maybe, she could belong somewhere again. The boy leaned against her leg, tired but safe. They were broken in different ways, scarred and cautious, but together, they were beginning to heal. And the road ahead, however long, however hard, was theirs to walk. The nights at the cabin had grown colder, the autumn wind whipping through the sparse trees like a restless ghost. Inside, the fire crackled with a warm glow, casting flickering shadows on the rough wooden walls. The boy sat on a worn chair, tracing imaginary lines on the floorboards with his dusty boots, while the woman scrubbed a stubborn stain from a tattered blanket. The stranger, the man who had become their reluctant guardian, sat on the edge of the bed, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that carried unspoken weight. Memories too painful to surface, yet too heavy to ignore. She wanted to ask questions, to reach through the distance that had grown between them all, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she kept cleaning, each scrub away to distract herself from the gnawing ache in her chest. The boy's voice broke the quiet, soft, and hesitant. "Mama, why did the bad men come after us?" She froze, the rag slipping from her fingers. She glanced down at him, eyes wide and vulnerable, a fragile soul trapped in a child's body. "I don't know, sweetheart," she whispered. "But I promise, we're safe now." The man shifted, his rough voice cutting through the stillness. They weren't just bad men, they were business. People who saw a price tag where a person should be. She looked up at him, surprised by the raw honesty. It was the first time he'd spoken about those men directly. A flicker of pain crossed his face, quickly masked by his usual stoicism. "Why did you buy us?" she asked, her voice trembling. He met her gaze squarely. "Because no one else would. Because someone had to." The room seemed to breathe with a new and fragile, uncertain, but real. Over the next days, the woman found herself wrestling with the ghosts of her past. Each night, as the fire died down and the world outside slipped into shadow, memories rose unbidden. She saw the house she had fled, walls stained with neglect, whispers of cruelty echoing in every corner. Her mother's cold eyes, the endless silence broken only by the harsh crack of a whip or a bitter word. The night she was sold, bartered like cattle in a town square, a price paid in coins and cruelty, her boy's small hands reached for hers, grounding her in the present. "I'm here," she murmured. "We're here." But even as she clung to the fragile safety of the cabin, the past threatened to unravel everything. One evening, the stranger returned from town with news that chilled her blood. "There are men looking for you," he said quietly, sitting down beside the fire. "Not just anyone. The ones who deal in shadows and fear." Hehatama. Why now? Why here? He shook his head. "They never forget, and they don't forgive." She looked at her son, sleeping fitfully on the cot, his face innocent and unscarred yet. Her mind raced with terrible possibilities. The next day, they prepared for the inevitable. The man taught them to defend themselves, to use every tool the land gave them: stones, sticks, the very earth beneath their feet. The woman found strength she hadn't known she had. The boy watched, absorbing every lesson, every whispered warning. Together, they built a fragile fortress of hope against the encroaching darkness. One night, as a storm raged outside, lightning illuminating the black sky in sharp, violent strokes, the past came crashing through the door. A shadowy figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, eyes glinting with malice. The man stepped forward, a rifle in hand. "You don't belong here," he said, voice cold as steel. The figure laughed, a cruel, hollow sound. "We belong wherever there's profit, and you've got something we want." The woman felt a cold sweat break across her brow. Her son clung to her side, trembling. The standoff stretched long and taut like the storm itself. Then, with a sudden roar, the figure moved fast, desperate. The man fired. The world exploded in chaos. After the smoke cleared, the woman stood trembling, eyes wide with shock. The man was bleeding, clutching his side. The shadowy figure lay still, unmoving. The boy screamed, tears streaming down his face. She rushed to the man's side, hands shaking as she pressed cloth to the wound. "Stay with me," she pleaded. He smiled weakly. "You're stronger than you know." In that moment, she realized the fight for survival wasn't just against the men of the past, but against the fear that threatened to consume them all. Together, they would face the darkness. Together, they would fight for a new dawn. The dawn broke cold and gray, leaking pale light through the thin curtains of the cabin. The night storm had left the earth soaked and raw, every breath they drew filled with the scent of wet pine and dirt. The world outside was still, but inside the small wooden house, the silence roared like thunder. The man lay on the rough mattress, the bloodstains dark and spreading across his shirt. His breathing was shallow, each exhale a reminder of the fragile thread on which his life now hung. The woman sat beside him, her hands trembling but steady, pressing a crude bandage tight against the wound. Her son sat at the far edge of the room, clutching a wooden toy horse-own she had carved for him when the days seemed brighter. He watched the two adults, his wide eyes flickering between hope and fear. Too young to understand the weight of what had happened, but old enough to sense the danger that lurked in every shadow. She leaned down, voice low and rough. "You have to hold on, we need you." He gave her a faint smile, fingers twitching as if to reassure her that he would try, that he would not give up so easily. They had come so far, and yet the fight was far from over. Outside, the rain had softened to a drizzle, the world washed clean but still trembling. The woman stood by the window, staring out at the soaked earth and the skeletal trees, the landscape scarred but alive. She thought about the journey that had brought them here, about the auction, the rope, the cold eyes of the townsfolk, the man who had stepped forward when no one else would. He had bought her, yes, but not to own, to free. She had never understood what that truly meant until now. The man wasn't a savior in shining armor. He was a survivor, carrying wounds just as deep and jagged as hers. Together, they had carved out a fragile sanctuary, but the outside world's cruelty still clawed at the edges. The boy needed safety. She needed peace. And the man, though battered, needed purpose. That morning, she woke early and prepared a weak broth. She stirred it quietly, mindful of the man's breathing in the next room. When she finally brought it to him, he opened his eyes briefly, enough to nod. "You're stubborn," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips despite the exhaustion. He chuckled, a sound barely more than a rasp. "We both are. he replied. The boy watched the exchange, sensing a bond deeper than words. Over the next days, the woman took on new roles. She learned to tend wounds, to read the faint signs of infection, to soothe pain with whispered words and careful hands. She learned the rhythms of the land when the mule needed water, when the wind would bring rain, how to move quietly through the trees to avoid unwanted attention. The man rested as best he could, grimacing when the pain flared, but never letting it break his resolve. He taught her how to use a rifle, how to read the signs of the forest, how to listen for danger long before it appeared. At night, the cabin grew cold, the wind howling like a mourning spirit around the eaves. The woman found herself waking, staring into the darkness, thoughts racing. The boy was safe for now, tucked under a threadbare blanket. But she knew the peace would not last. Her mind wandered back to the auction block, her mother's harsh voice, the sting of the rope biting into her wrists, the faces of the men who had looked at her as nothing more than property. How many times had she believed escape was impossible? How many times had she felt so broken that surrender seemed the only option? But here, in this broken house with its creaking floors and fading walls, something new was growing. A fragile hope that whispered that survival was not enough, that she could live, that she could build. One evening, the man sat by the fire, staring into the flames as if searching for answers. She sat beside him, the boy asleep in his bed. "You think they'll come back?" she asked quietly. He didn't look at her at first. "Maybe," he said finally, "but we're not the same people they knew." She nodded slowly. "We have each other now." The silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. It was a silence filled with unspoken promises and the quiet understanding that they were building something fragile and precious. Days turned to weeks. The man's wound healed slowly, the pain a constant reminder of the battle they had fought and the battles yet to come. The woman found strength in the routine, steady rhythm of work, the small victories of each day. She planted a small garden, coaxing life from the stubborn earth. She sewed patches onto worn clothes, taught her son to read from tattered books, and learned the names of the birds that visited the clearing. The boy grew stronger too, laughter beginning to bubble up in the quiet corners of the house. For the first time in years, she saw him smile without fear. But the world beyond the trees still whispered threats. One afternoon, a distant rider appeared on the horizontal messenger from the town, his face grim and eyes wary. The man met the rider at the edge of the clearing. "She's under my protection," he said flatly when the rider spoke of debts and old grudges. The rider left without another word. That night, as they sat together on the porch, the woman realized the cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a home. The creaks in the floor sounded less like ghosts and more like the steady heartbeat of something alive. She leaned her head against the man's shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. For the first time in a long time, she dared to hope. The battle wasn't over, but the quiet war they fought against fear, against pain, against the past was theirs. And they would win it, together. The mornings came slow and heavy now, wrapped in a chill that settled deep into the bones. The earth beneath their feet was still damp, and the air carried the scent of moss and forgotten rain. Inside the house, the silence no longer felt like an enemy. It was a fragile friendone that wrapped around the corners and filled the empty spaces with possibility. She rose early, as always, to light the stove and prepare the modest breakfast. The scent of coffee drifted softly through the air, mingling with the faint aroma of bread she had baked just yesterday, small luxury they both quietly treasured. He was already awake, sitting by the window, his hands clasped around a tin cup, staring out at the pale landscape as if searching for a future that felt both impossible and necessary. She slid quietly beside him, careful not to disturb the fragile calm. For a moment, neither spoke. Outside, the wind teased the bare branches of the old oak, carrying the promise of coming frost. "I never thought I'd see a morning like this," she said finally, her voice breaking the stillness. "Not like this." He turned his gaze from the window to her face. His eyes were steady, but tired, worn from too many battles fought on too many fronts. "Neither did I," he said. But here we are. They were two souls bound not by words, but by the shared weight of survival and a quiet determination to build something better from the ruins. The boy stirred in the next room, his soft footsteps padding through the hallway as he followed the smell of breakfast. She watched him, the way he moved tentative yet growing stronger each day. He was learning to trust again, to believe in safety and warmth. The light in his eyes had returned, fragile but real. It was a light she guarded fiercely, the one thing that made the hardships bearable. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of their lives settled into a steady pulse. They worked side by side, he repairing the weathered fence, she tending the garden that slowly began to bloom under her careful hands. They shared meals in silence, their conversations limited to gestures and the occasional word. But the space between them was filled with something deeper, a growing sense of trust. At night, the fire's glow painted their faces in flickering shadows as they sat on the porch, the boy asleep inside, dreaming of worlds they could only hope to build. One evening, she found herself speaking into the dusk, words falling from her lips like a confession. "I don't know how to be whole," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Not after everything." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached over, a rough hand brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "You're already whole," he said quietly. "In your own way." The days were not without their struggles. The past clung to them like a stubborn shadow, creeping in through memories, and the wary glances of those who refused to forget. One afternoon, a visitor arrived at a woman from the nearby town, her eyes sharp and her tone colder than the wind. She came with questions, with whispered accusations, trying to unravel the fragile thread of peace they had woven. But the man stood firm, his presence a silent warning. "She's under my protection," he said, voice steady and unyielding. The woman left without further challenge. But the message lingered outside, forces still sought to disrupt the fragile sanctuary. In the quiet moments that followed, the woman found herself wrestling with old fears. Would the past ever truly let them go? Or were they destined to be prisoners of their history, forever running from shadows? She looked to the man who bore his own scars, some visible, others buried deep within. Their silence spoke volumes. They were each other's keepers now, bound by unspoken promises and the tentative threads of trust. One night, as the wind howled outside and the house creaked with age, she reached for his hand. It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. He didn't pull away. Instead, he squeezed her hand gently, anchoring her in the moment. For the first time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, they could build a life not defined by loss, but by hope. The boy woke the next morning to find them sitting close together by the fire, their hands still intertwined. He smiled, a bright, innocent smile that filled the room with light. In that moment, the woman understood. They were no longer just surviving. They were beginning to live. The days grew colder as autumn deepened, but inside the house, warmth blossomed in small, quiet ways. She learned to read his silent glances, to anticipate his needs without words. He noticed the way she folded the laundry with careful hands, how she hummed soft tunes while working. Their lives were no longer fractured pieces, but slowly coming together patchwork, stitched with patience and care. One afternoon, as they repaired the barn roof together, the man paused and looked at her. "Do you think we're ready?" he asked quietly. "For what?" she replied, heart pounding. "To let the past go." She hesitated, then nodded. "We have to be." The barn stood tall, a symbol of their shared strength, weathered but unbroken. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, she whispered, "I think I'm starting to believe in us." He smiled, a rare, genuine smile that lit his worn face. "Me too." They sat in silence, two souls connected by more than words. The house, once a hollow shell, breathed with the promise of new beginnings. And for the first time, they both dared to hope that healing was possible, not just for them, but for the family they were becoming. The morning came crisp, with a biting chill that signaled the slow march of winter. The horizon glowed faintly with the first hints of dawn, pale and tentative. Inside the house, the fire still smoldered in the hearth, casting gentle light against the worn wooden walls. The quiet was almost sacred, like the space between heartbeats where everything held its breath. She woke before the sun, as usual, her body aching slightly from yesterday's work in the garden and barn. The small rituals of their days, lighting the stove, filling the kettle, stirring the porridge, grounded her in a world that once felt too fragile to hold on to. He was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a chipped mug, eyes distant, as they traced the patterns of frost forming on the window panes. She approached quietly, the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath her feet breaking the silence like a whispered secret. "I thought the frost would have claimed the fields by now," she murmured. He looked up, a slow smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, worn, but genuine. "It's stubborn," he replied. "Just like us." Their lives had settled into a rhythm that felt almost natural. The house was no longer just a shelter, but a home where trust could grow, thread by fragile thread. Still, the past was never far behind. It hovered at the edges of their days, like a restless shadow refusing to be banished. Sometimes, she would catch herself flinching at a sudden noise, the snap of a twig outside, a slammed door in the night. Sometimes, the old nightmares crept in, wrapped in the dark folds of memory. But here, with him, those shadows lost their edge. They had learned, slowly and painfully, how to share the burden of their scars without being consumed by them. One afternoon, she found herself standing at the edge of the small pond behind the house, the water still and mirror-like, reflecting the bare trees and slate-gray sky. She traced a finger through the dirt, stirring up small clouds of dust, her thoughts tangled in a web of hope and fear. How do you move forward when every step feels weighted by what you've lost? How do you open your heart when the cracks seem too deep to mend? She turned as he approached, the sound of his boots muffled by the soft earth. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked quietly. He paused, considering the question as he looked out over the water. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but then I remember what I'd be leaving behind. And it's never worth it." She nodded, feeling a flicker of something warm, a fragile ember of belonging. The days grew colder, and the nights longer. But inside the house, something new was taking root. They began to share more than space. They shared stories, memories, and even dreams. She told him about the first time she had seen a field of wildflowers, how the colors had seemed impossible after all the gray years. He spoke of his own losses, of a family torn apart by war and hardship, of promises broken and hopes dashed. Neither sought pity, nor did they offer it. Instead, they exchanged understanding, a gift more precious than words. One evening, after a quiet meal, she found a bundle of old photographs tucked away in a drawer. They were yellowed and fragile, images of people she didn't know but somehow felt connected to. He watched as she traced a finger over a faded face, a woman with eyes like storms, a man with a cautious smile. "These are my family," he said softly, "before everything fell apart." She looked up, surprise flickering in her gaze. "I didn't know you had this," she whispered. He shrugged, a shadow crossing his features. It was easier to forget for a while. She reached out, placing her hand over his. "You don't have to forget anymore," she said. "You have me." Their bond grew stronger with each passing day, but the outside world was relentless. Rumors spread through the nearby town, whispers about the girl who had been bought and the man who sheltered her. Some looked with suspicion, others with thinly veiled contempt. One afternoon, a group of townsfolk gathered near the edge of the property, voices raised in anger and fear. The man stepped forward, his presence commanding and unyielding. "This is my land, my home, and they are under my protection. Leave now, or face consequences you won't like." The crowd dispersed, but the tension lingered like a storm cloud on the horizon. In the solitude of the evening, she found herself questioning everything. Was this life enough? Could they truly escape the past? Or were they destined to be prisoners of their histories forever? She confided in the quiet night, her voice barely more than a whisper. I want to believe in us, but sometimes it feels like the world is against us. He came to her side, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. We have each other, he said firmly. And sometimes that's enough. Winter settled over the land like a heavy blanket, frosting the fields and silencing the birds. The house was warm, lit by firelight and softened by the steady presence of each other. They spent long evenings repairing old furniture, reading worn books, and dreaming of futures where pain didn't define them. One night, as the wind howled outside, she looked up from the book in her lap. Do you ever regret it? She asked. He met her gaze, steady and unwavering. Buying you? She nodded. No. But I do regret waiting so long to find you. As the seasons turned, so did their hearts. They learned to navigate the delicate dance of trust and vulnerability, of giving and receiving. The scars they bore were still there, some hidden, some visible, but they no longer controlled them. Together, they carved out a space where healing was possible, where love could take root even in the harshest soil. One morning, she woke to find a note by her bedside. It was simple, handwritten on faded paper. You are not alone. We are building something real. Together. Tears spilled down her cheeks, not of sorrow, but of something deeper. Gratitude, hope, a new beginning. She folded the note carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket, ready to face whatever the future held. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, she walked it with purpose. No longer defined by the shadows of her past, she embraced the light they were creating, one small moment, one quiet step at a time. The morning light was pale and thin, filtering through the worn curtains and spilling softly over the creaky floorboards. The house stirred awake with small sounds, a kettle whistling, footsteps padding quietly, the soft murmur of the mule in its stall. Outside, the wind whispered through the skeletal branches of the oaks, hinting at the cold to come. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug, the heat seeping slowly into her fingers but doing little to thaw the chill inside. Her eyes traced the weathered grain of the table, a surface worn smooth by years of handsome trembling, some steady touching it. He was in the corner, sharpening a knife. The rhythmic rasp of stone against steel was steady, familiar. It filled the space between them like an unspoken language, one they had grown used to over the months. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable but weighted thick with memories neither was ready to voice. There were wounds beneath that quiet, open, and raw, and both understood the cost of words left unsaid. Months had passed since the auction, time measured not just by the turn of seasons, but by the slow weaving of trust. Each day, she learned to shed a layer of fear, like a snake slipping out of a worn skin. Each evening, he grew more comfortable with the quiet companionship they shared, less burdened by ghosts long buried. Yet, the past had a way of creeping back, uninvited. That day, while working near the barn, a sudden noise made her flinch. A sharp bark from the mule, a creak of timber. The weight of every moment in her past pressed down in an instant. The sudden violence, the cold hands that had once tied her to posts, the murmurs of townsfolk, the harsh glare of her mother's eyes as she traded her like a common good. Her breath caught, heart racing like a wild horse breaking free from its tether. He was at her side before she could retreat into herself, steady and calm. It's just the mule, he said softly, nothing else. But she knew better. Fear was not easily quelled. It lingered like a shadow, dark and deep. That night, sleep was a stranger. She lay awake in the small room upstairs, the wooden walls creaking as if whispering secrets. She thought of the countless nights spent locked away, sheds, barns, empty rooms where silence meant suffering. The cold loneliness of being invisible in a world that wanted to forget her. And yet, here she was, free. Or as free as one could be when the mind played tricks and memories clawed at the edges of peace. He knocked softly on the doorframe. I thought you might be awake, he said, voice low. She nodded, inviting him in with a tilt of her head. He sat beside her on the bed, close but not too close, respecting the fragile boundaries they had built. "I never asked," she began hesitantly. "Why did you really buy me? Not just to save me, but why you?" He looked at her for a long moment, eyes reflecting something older than time. "Because I saw something worth saving," he finally said. "Not just in you, but in the life we could build." She swallowed hard, the weight of those words sinking deep. "I'm scared I'll never escape who I was." "You're not who you were," he whispered. "You're who you're becoming." Days melted into weeks, their lives intertwined in quiet patterns, the careful mending of fences, the slow tending of the land, the shared meals where words were few but meaning ran deep. She began to speak more, her voice gaining strength with each story told not of pain, but of small victories. The taste of fresh bread, the feel of soft earth between her fingers, the warmth of a fire after a long day. He listened, always listening, as if cataloging every precious moment. One afternoon, while repairing the barn door, she found an old journal tucked beneath the loose floorboards. Its leather cover was cracked, pages yellowed and brittle. Curiosity tugged at her fingers as she opened it, revealing a chronicle of a lifelong past sketches of horses, notes about crops, and entries filled with hope and despair. She traced the words carefully, feeling a connection to the unknown Rytera soul who had fought battles similar to her own. She showed it to him that evening, her eyes bright with quiet wonder. "This was his," he said simply, voice thick with memory. "My father's—" A silence fell, heavy with the weight of lineage and loss. The townsfolk's whispers grew louder. Not everyone believed in second chances. One day, a group of men arrived at the edge of the property, voices raised in accusation and suspicion. They questioned his right to keep her, to shelter someone with a past so tangled in pain and shame. He stood firm, unwavering, his words carrying the weight of years spent fighting for what mattered. "She's under my protection," he said, "and you'll find no fault here." The men retreated, but the threat lingered in the air like a storm brewing. Back inside, she felt the walls closing in again. The house that had once been a refuge felt suddenly fragile. She paced the floor, hands clenched, heart pounding. "Why won't they just leave us be?" she whispered to the empty room. He took her hand, steady and warm. Because sometimes the hardest battles are fought, not with fists, but with courage. She looked at him, searching for the strength she needed to hold on, and found it. Winter deepened, and with it, the nights grew colder and longer. They spent hours by the fire, the flickering flames casting shadows that danced along the walls. She began to teach him small things to mend a torn shirt, how to weave simple patterns in cloth. He taught her how to ride with steadier hands, how to read the signs of weather in the sky. Their worlds, once so fractured, began to meld into something whole. One evening, she found a letter tucked inside the journal. The handwriting was her father's, fragile but determined. It spoke of dreams for a better life, of promises to protect what mattered most. Her eyes filled with tears. She realized then that despite the past's weight, there was always room for hope. As spring neared, the air softened. New life stirred beneath the thawing earth. They planted seeds, tending the soil as if nurturing their own fragile dreams. And with every shoot that broke the ground, a promise was made, a promise to keep growing, to keep healing. The house breathed with them, its walls holding stories of survival and love. The porch light shone steady each night, a beacon for two souls who had found their way through the darkness. Together, they learned that healing was not a destination, but a journey. And on that journey, they were no longer alone. The mornings came slow and steady, like the river winding through the valley below the ridge. She had begun to recognize the rhythm of life here, not just the routines, but the unspoken promises woven into the dawn light, the smell of damp earth, and the soft creak of the old porch boards beneath worn boots. It was strange, this new existence. Not loud or sudden, but subtle, the kind of change that sneaks in like the first bloom of spring, unnoticed until one day the world is simply different. She was no longer just the girl with dust on her ankles, or the auctioned child from a forgotten town square. She was becoming someone who belonged. Slowly, painfully, piece by piece. The scars beneath her skin, invisible to the eye, began to fade, not because they disappeared, but because they were no longer the whole story. He watched her with a quiet pride that surprised even himself. There was a tenderness in his gaze when she worked the fields, sweat glistening on her brow, determination setting her jaw firm. No words were needed to say he believed in her, that he saw her not as broken, but as unyielding. One afternoon, while stacking firewood by the barn, she paused and looked up at the sky, awash of pale blue and drifting clouds. "Does the sky always look so endless here?" she wondered aloud, though he was out of earshot. The vast openness stretched beyond the horizons of her old life. A reminder that sometimes freedom wasn't just a place but a feeling. Their days were marked by simple moments: the mule's braying greeting at dawn, the scent of fresh bread baking in the oven, the shared quiet as they ate their meals. And sometimes, after the chores were done, they would sit on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the ridge, colors bleeding into one another like watercolors on aged paper. Trust, she learned, was not spoken in grand declarations but built in these small, steady ways. When he handed her a warm shawl on a chilly night, the gesture said more than any words could. When she left the door between their rooms slightly ajar, it was not a plea but an offering, a cautious hope. There were nights when the ghosts came back, flickers of memory that tightened her chest and quickened her breath. The echoes of voices that had once traded her like property. But each time, the house stood firm, and so did he. His presence was an anchor against the storms within her. One day, the weather shifted suddenly. The wind picked up, cold and sharp, scattering dry leaves like confetti over the barren fields. She shivered, wrapping the shawl tighter around her shoulders. The mule stamped nervously in its stall. The storm was coming. As the first fat drops of rain fell, they hurried to the barn, securing doors and stacking hay to keep the animals safe. Lightning split the sky, thunder rolling like distant drums. She clung to the rough wooden post, heart pounding not just from fear, but from a deeper storm raging inside. That night, the wind howled through the cracks in the barn roof, rain drumming relentlessly. They sat close by the fire, sharing the warmth and silence. She thought of her mother's harsh eyes, the crowd's cruel laughter, the rope that had once bound her wrists. But here, in this small sanctuary, she was free. He spoke softly then, breaking the quiet. "Tell me about the storm inside you," he said. For the first time, she let the words spill out the fear, the pain, the heavy weight of memories. He listened without interruption, his steady presence a balm. In the days that followed, they worked side by side to repair the barn roof, hands busy while hearts slowly healed. Each nail hammered into place was a small victory. The house was no longer just wood and stone. It was a refuge where two broken souls were mending together. The town still whispered. Rumors followed them like shadows, dark and persistent. But she learned to hold her head high, the strength in her eyes quiet but undeniable. No longer the girl to be sold or silenced, but a woman who had chosen to rise. One evening, as the fires sputtered low and the stars blinked awake, she found herself speaking of dreams not just of survival, but of a future. A life where she could belong, love, and be loved without fear. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he took her hand, warm and sure. That touch carried promises, not of perfection, but of presence. Not of erasing the past, but of walking forward together. And in that moment, she realized that freedom was more than running away. It was choosing to stay, to build, to heal. The days stretched longer. The seasons shifted. She no longer counted the hours until morning, but treasured the dawn. And in the quiet between moments, she found a voice that had long been buried. Their bond was no longer fragile. It was a quiet force, like the river carving canyons over centuries, slow but unstoppable. Together, they were building a life not defined by loss, but by resilience. She caught her reflection one morning, not in a mirror, but in the still water of the creek behind the house. Her eyes held a new light, steady and bright. She was no longer just surviving. She was living. The morning air held a fragile calm, but beneath that quiet surface, the memories stirred like restless animals waking from a long, uneasy sleep. She knew they would always be there, the shadows lurking in the corners of her mind, uninvited yet persistent. The past had a way of creeping in on the edges of every peaceful moment, a reminder that survival was never simple. She woke early, before the sun had fully stretched its golden fingers across the sky. The house was silent, except for the soft creaks of wood settling and the distant chirping of birds greeting the dawn. Stepping barefoot onto the cold floor, she paused by the window, watching as mist curled over the fields like a living thing. The world outside seemed new every day, yet inside, the same old questions gnawed at her. Why had her mother given her away like a piece of broken furniture? Why had no one stopped the crowd's laughter, the auctioneer's callous words? And why did it still hurt so much, even here, so far from that square? She didn't ask these questions aloud. The house was patient but silent. And the man who had saved her, if that's what he was, didn't push for answers either. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that some wounds were too deep for quick fixes. That day, she set out to the edge of the property where the wildflowers grew tangled and free. The sun was higher now, warm against her skin, and for a moment, the weight of old fears lifted like morning fog burning away. She knelt by a cluster of bluebells, their delicate petals trembling in the breeze. She plucked one gently, folding it between her fingers, fragile but alive. Maybe, she thought, she could be like these flowers battered by storms, but still blooming. The sound of footsteps behind her made her stiffen. He stood there, hands tucked in his pockets, eyes steady on the horizon. "You've been quiet," he said. She shook her head slowly. "Just thinking." He nodded, as if that explained everything and nothing all at once. There was a long silence between them before he spoke again. "People in town, they still watch, still whisper." She looked up at him, eyes clear and unafraid. "Let them." He studied her, a flicker of something like admiration crossing his face. "You're not the girl they sold anymore." "No," she said, "I'm not." Weeks passed, and the seasons shifted from the fiery reds of late summer to the crisp golds of early autumn. With every day, the house felt less like a refuge from the world and more like home. She learned to tend the garden, coaxing life from stubborn earth. He taught her how to mend tools, how to read the sky for weather, how to listen to the silence between the birdsong. Their bond deepened not in grand gestures, but in the simple acts of daily life-sharing meals, fixing fences, sitting side by side in the fading light. One evening, as the wind carried the scent of rain through the open windows, she found herself opening a door she'd kept locked inside. "I'm scared," she whispered, the words barely a breath. He didn't respond immediately, but the space between them grew soft and warm like a hearth fire. "I'm scared," she repeated, "of the past catching me, of never being free." He reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "Freedom isn't a place, it's a choice. You choose to stay, to fight, to heal." She let out a shaky breath, the tension easing from her shoulders. For the first time, she believed it might be true. That night, the rain came hard and steady, drumming on the roof like the pounding of a restless heart. Inside, they sat close, the flickering candlelight casting dancing shadows on worn walls. She traced the lines on his weathered hands, feeling the strength beneath the scars. "Why did you save me?" she asked softly. He looked at her, eyes reflecting the firelight. "Because no one else would. Because sometimes saving someone means giving them a chance to be more than what they were." She smiled faintly, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I want to be more." "And you will," he promised. But the past was never far away. The whispers in town grew louder. Faces that had once looked away now stared openly, filled with suspicion or disdain. One day, a man she recognized from the auction approached the gate, eyes cold and calculating. "You don't belong here," he spat. "Not really. Just a thing to be used and discarded." She stood tall, no longer the frightened girl who once trembled at such words. "This is my home," she said firmly. "And I belong." The man sneered but said nothing more, retreating into the shadows. That night, the man who had bought her, who had freed her, sat beside her on the porch, the silence between them heavy but unbroken. "You're stronger than they know," he said. She nodded, looking out at the darkening fields.
"I'm trying."
"And you're not alone." That promise settled between them like a seed planted in rich soil. In the weeks that followed, they prepared for winter, stacking wood, sealing windows, repairing the barn. She learned to read the stars, to anticipate the coming storms. And in the quiet moments, they talked not always with words, but with looks, touches, the soft comfort of presence. One evening, under a sky heavy with snow-laden clouds, she found a small box waiting for her on the kitchen table. Inside was a hand-stitched cloth, a simple ribbon, and a folded letter. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the paper. The handwriting was his. "You are not what they called you. You are what you survived. You are what you choose to become." Tears blurred the words, but she pressed the note to her heart. For the first time, she felt whole. The house no longer echoed with loneliness. It hummed with life and hope. And as the first snowflakes drifted down, blanketing the earth in quiet white, she knew she had found more than shelter. She had found a future. That winter came slowly, wrapped in cold breath and brittle silence. The frost crept over the windows like a thin veil, and the world outside folded into shades of white and gray. Inside, the fire in the hearth crackled, its warmth a fragile shield against the lengthening nights. She sat near the flickering flames, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee, staring at the shifting shadows on the wall. The house was quiet, but inside her, something was stirring, a tempest barely held in check. Years of pain, years of running, years of silent suffering had built a wall around her heart. And now, that wall was cracking, piece by piece. She remembered the auction square, the harsh sun, the rough rope, the jeering crowd, the moment when the man had stepped forward, steady and silent, and broken the chain of her despair. That moment was her anchor, the start of a fragile hope. But hope was a double-edged thing. He limped into the room, the bandage around his shoulder stained but healing. His eyes found hers across the dim room, soft, with something unspoken. "You've been quiet again," he said, settling into the chair across from her. She gave a small, bitter smile. "It's harder some days." He nodded knowingly. "The past doesn't stay buried." "No," she whispered. "It waits." That night, the storm came with a fury that rattled the walls and shook the old timbers. Rain hammered the roof like fists of regret, thunder rolling through the hills like the echo of distant pain. She stood at the window, watching lightning crack the sky in wild bursts. Her breath fogged the glass, a fleeting imprint of a fragile soul. When the door creaked open behind her, she didn't turn. "I'm here," he said softly. And somehow, those two words were enough. They moved slowly towards each other, not out of sudden passion, but the careful dance of two broken people learning trust. His hands, rough and scarred, reached out and held hers, steadying the tremble she barely noticed in herself. "I'm scared," she admitted, voice breaking. "Scared that the past will catch me, that I'll never be free." He brushed a tear from her cheek. "Freedom isn't a place, it's a choice. You choose to stay, to fight, to heal." She looked up at him, eyes shining with tentative hope. "I want to believe that." Days turned into weeks, and the seasons shifted again. Spring whispered through the budding trees, coaxing life from frozen earth. The house, once hollow and silent, thrummed with the rhythm of new beginnings. She worked alongside him in the fields, the sun warming her face, the dirt under her nails grounding her to this reclaimed life. The scars in her heart still throbbed, but they no longer defined her. One afternoon, As the wind stirred the tall grass, she found herself laughing, a sound so rare it startled even her. He was nearby, watching with that quiet, steady gaze that said he understood without needing words. It was the first real laughter she'd known in years, a fragile bloom in the garden of her healing. But healing wasn't a straight road. The town's whispers hadn't fully faded. Shadows of suspicion still lingered in glances and murmurs. Yet each day she stood taller, unafraid to meet the world's judgment. She was no longer the girl sold like cattle. She was a woman who had survived hell and chose to keep moving forward. One evening, he handed her a worn leather-bound book, a journal, empty except for a single page at the front. "Write your story," he said. "For yourself." Her fingers traced the cracked leather, hesitant but drawn to the promise inside. That night, by candlelight, she wrote not the pain, not the fear, but the hope, the fight, the small victories, the story of a girl who refused to be broken. Time passed, and the seasons cycled in their endless dance. The house grew warmer, filled with laughter, with music, with the quiet moments shared between two souls who had learned to trust. She no longer flinched at the wind slamming doors. He no longer wore the weight of his scars in silence. Together, they built a home not just of wood and stone, but of forgiveness, of acceptance, of love. Then came the day they chose to make it official, a quiet ceremony on the porch, beneath a sky blushing with the first light of dawn. No grand guests, no preacher, just two hands joined with whispered promises and eyes full of unspoken truths. She wasn't a bride made perfect by fairy tales. She was real, raw, and resolute. And he wasn't a hero, but a man willing to stand in the storm. Their vows weren't words shouted to the world, but quiet pledges in the sanctuary of shared pain and healing. "I choose you," she said, voice steady. "And I choose you," he replied. And in that choice, they both found freedom, not the freedom of escape, but the freedom of belonging. The house breathed with them, a living testament to the power of survival, the grace of second chances. If you pass by now, you might hear the faint hum of laughter, the soft creak of rocking chairs, the murmur of stories told late into the night. Two chairs always filled, two hearts, once broken, now whole. And so the story ends not with a fairy tale, but with a truth far deeper. Some broken things don't need fixing. They need naming. Naming the pain, the fight, the courage to stay. And in that naming, finding a way to breathe again. The first light of dawn spilled over the ridge like a promise, pale, soft, and unwavering. She woke before the sun fully rose, the quiet weight of the night's dreams still lingering in her chest. Dreams of chains broken, of dark rooms left behind, of a past that no longer defined her. Slowly, carefully, she rose and stepped to the window. The world outside was still wrapped in the gentle hush of morning, dew clinging to blades of grass, the air crisp with the scent of pine and earth. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she didn't feel like running. The house breathed softly around her, every creak and sigh a familiar note in the song of this new life. She dressed quietly, the worn clothes a comfort, the simple apron tied around her waist like a shield forged from resilience. At the bottom of the stairs, the aroma of fresh coffee beckoned her forward. There he was, leaning against the doorframe, watching her with the same steady gaze that had pulled her back from the edge so many times before. No words were needed. They moved together through the morning routine, quiet and unhurried. The sun climbed higher, and light poured into every corner, chasing away shadows like old fears. She noticed the way his hands moved with careful purpose, how he tended the mule as if it carried not just burdens but stories of survival, how he looked at her sometimes like she was both fragile and fierce all at once. That day, something shifted. The weight of silence between them wasn't absence, but presence. A language only they understood, spoken in glances and gentle touches. Later, outside on the porch, she sat with bare feet, resting on the weathered wood, the shawl he'd given her draped loosely over her shoulders. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying away the ghosts that had haunted her for too long. She turned to him, heart steady for the first time. "I'm ready," she said simply. He met her gaze, calm and sure. "For what?" "To live. Really live, not just survive." He smiled, the kind that reached his eyes and softened something deep inside. "We'll learn together." The world beyond the ridge still held its judgments, the whispers and sideways glances, but they no longer carried power. She had learned to stand tall, to meet those looks without flinching, because she wasn't alone anymore. That evening, they walked the path to the creek behind the house, the water moving slow and golden under the setting sun. The sky was a canvas of bruised purples and fiery amber, the kind of beauty that spoke of endings and beginnings all at once. There, with the land stretching wide and free, they made their vows not to some grand crowd, but to each other in the quiet witness of wind and water. No preacher's words, no scripted promises, just raw truth. "I choose you," she said, voice steady and sure. "And I choose you," he replied. Two hands clasped, two hearts bound. The years that followed were not free of hardship, but they were theirs, filled with moments of grace and grit, of laughter and quiet understanding. She grew into the woman she never thought she could be: whole, strong, loved. He found a reason to heal beyond the scars, beyond the pain. Together they built a life that was more than a house, it was a home. Sometimes, late at night, they would sit side by side on the porch. The world hushed around them, and in the soft glow of lantern light, she would rest her head on his shoulder and whisper, "I'm not who I was." He'd squeeze her hand gently and say, "You're exactly who you need to be." This was the story of two broken souls who didn't wait to be saved. They chose to save themselves and each other, not with grand gestures, but with quiet courage, with patience, with the fierce, steady breath of love. If you ever find yourself near that ridge, just past the cottonwoods where the house stands tall and weathered, listen closely. You might hear the laughter carried on the wind, soft and sure. You might see two chairs on the porch, always filled. Two lives, once lost, now found. And maybe, just maybe, you'll believe in the power of choosing to stay. If you were in their shoes, would you fight the same battle? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear from you. Don't forget to like the video and explore the other stories waiting for you on screen. Thanks for watching.